Hey, hello again. Thank you very much for that musical item, that was amazing. As I said earlier, I am an ordinary consumer who doesn't want to buy food produced by slave labour. And I'm wanting to talk this morning about some research I've been doing into food companies and food brands that can guarantee that their supply chains are slave-free. This might seem surprising. After all, wasn't slavery outlawed more than 100 years ago, basically everywhere? Or perhaps you have heard of slavery, but you've heard of it in the context of the sex industry, people who are working against their will in the sex industry. But that doesn't really have anything to do with food. But in terms of slavery today, I was quite horrified not that long ago to realise that the International Labour Organisation reckons there's about 40 million people working as slaves today. That's more than 8 times the population of New Zealand, or about the same as the population of Canada. And when they say slavery, they're not necessarily meaning people who are unpaid, but they are saying that this is people who are working against their will and are unable to leave. In some cases that means they're physically confined. In other cases it means they're kept there by threats of violence or by having travel documents taken off them and so on. And what are these people doing? 40 million people. Of them, there's 5 million who are working in the sex trade. Those are the people you hear about most often, I think. There's also 15 million who are in forced marriage. So that's not arranged marriages where they don't know each other. That's people who never intended to get married, but are forced into it by other people. And then the remainder, 20 million people, are doing ordinary jobs. And in terms of ordinary jobs, there's people who work in domestic service, so they are working as a servant in someone's house. There's people who work in construction, doing road building, building buildings. But there's also people who work in farming and in fishing and in factories. And those people I'm particularly concerned about. People in farming, fishing and factories work for us. Stuff that those people make is hidden and amongst the regular goods that we find in ordinary shops here in New Zealand. So in terms of things that you buy that might have slavery in their supply chain, the highest risk goods are electronics. This is an order, so the most highest risk good is electronics, so mobile phones, laptops, that kind of thing. Textiles, so your clothing and other things made of fabric. And then fish, cocoa and sugar. There's other people looking into electronics and textiles. In terms of electronics, Baptist World Alliance in Australia has done some reports on the supply chains of electronics, some of the big brands available there, many of which are here as well. And Tear Fund, the Christian development charity here, has an ethical fashion guide that they update each year, looking at different brands. So other people are doing electronics and textiles, so I focused on food. That's the fish, cocoa and sugar. And when I do that, I'm looking for companies that can guarantee that their whole supply chain is free of both child labour and slave labour. And by guarantee, I mean, is someone actually checking? It's all well and good to get people to make promises, but I'm looking for companies where someone physically goes out to the farm, to the factory, ideally to the fishing boat, and sees what's actually going on. And when I've been contacting companies, I've also been asking other questions about their supply chain. So asking, are you paying a living wage? Are working conditions safe? All that kind of thing. So my bottom line is no child labour, no slave labour. But if there's other good stuff going on as well, I want to highlight that. So how did I get involved in this? If you know my parents, Tony and Norman, you'll know that I've recently recovered from about 15 years where I was largely bedbound. During that time, I couldn't really read, so I listened to the BBC World Service Radio a lot. And back in 2006, I heard a report about the cocoa industry. And they were saying that about a third of all the cocoa in the world was grown in Ivory Coast, that's in West Africa, and about a third of that was grown by child slaves. So kids who were beaten, forced to work, weren't going to school. And I was really horrified by that. The situation in cocoa has changed a bit since 2006, that was a while ago, but currently more than 20% of all the cocoa grown in the world today is grown by children. And when I say children, I mean children. They start generally about 8, maybe 10, but really, honestly, children. They don't go to school, they're working full time. And it's very dangerous and difficult and harsh work. And as I was listening to this report and thinking about it, I thought about the story of the Good Samaritan that was read to us earlier, which was indeed the reading intended. And in that, the lawyer's coming to Jesus wanting to know what he can do to inherit eternal life. And Jesus is like, you have to love your neighbour as yourself. And the lawyer's like, well, who's my neighbour? And Jesus tells the story of the chap who gets beaten up, left for dead. 2 different religious leaders come by, they ignore him. But then the Samaritan comes by and goes above and beyond to help him out. And the moral I've always taken from that story is that Jesus calls us to help anyone we come across who needs our help. Anyone who needs our help that we encounter is our neighbour. And courtesy of BBC journalist, I kind of realised every time I ate chocolate, in a sense, I was encountering a kid in West Africa who needed my help. So how to respond to that? In the first instance, I moved to only buying fair trade cocoa and chocolate for my own consumption. And then over the years, as more and more options became available, I started to maintain a list of all the fairly traded cocoa products that were available in New Zealand and to try and make that list available. And that list today has got all kinds of things on it. It's got ice cream, it's got chocolate milk, it's got cosmetics made with cocoa butter, it's got pretty much anything you can imagine made with cocoa except for chocolate biscuits. Someone needs to do chocolate biscuits. But in many cases, costing no more than an equivalent non-fair trade option. That was the first step with cocoa. And then around 3 years ago, stories started coming out in the New Zealand media about the fishing industry. And you may have heard some of these too. They were saying that men from low-income countries like Cambodia and Indonesia were being tricked into working on fishing boats. They were told they'd have good pay. Maybe they were told they'd be working in a factory. Maybe they were told they were going to be working on the kind of fishing boat that goes out just for a day or two and then comes back. But then when they got to that job, they found out that they were actually being trapped, working on boats that would stay out at sea for many months, even literally years. So the fishing boat stays out at sea, another boat comes backwards and forwards taking off the fish, and they stay on that boat and they are stuck. And those men are sometimes paid very little, often paid literally nothing at all. And the stories were saying that people who were on those boats who complained about the conditions were being raped, that people were being murdered. And unlike the cocoa stuff, this isn't happening far off in West Africa. The Thai fishing industry is particularly bad, but it's also happening in the South Pacific, and it's even literally happening here. In March of last year, a fishing company was convicted for not paying its workers at all for 2 years, fishing in New Zealand waters. So I was hearing these things, and they're terrible, but I didn't know what to do. With cocoa, I had found there were certifications that I could look for that I could trust, but I realised for fish there were no certifications. Also, as I said, I was very ill at the time, and my specialist had said for my health it would be very helpful if I ate oily fish twice a week. So just not eating fish didn't seem like a good option, and it all just felt too hard. So while I was thinking about that, a friend drew my attention to Micah chapter 6. So this is in the Old Testament. The prophet is speaking on behalf of God to the people of Israel. And he's saying, "Can I forget the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the scant measure that is accursed? Can I tolerate wicked scales and a bag of dishonest weights?" So that's kind of a bit obscure, but he's saying, but you'll see there's the scant measure, the wicked scales, the dishonest weights. When the Israelites were going to trade in the market, they had measuring things that were deliberately just a bit wrong. So someone would go to the market intending to buy a kilo of grain, but the measuring thing was wrong, and so they'd get just a wee bit less than they'd paid for. And God was really angry about this. The whole rest of that chapter is basically just curses, God really calling out the Israelites because of this. And that trickery, that dishonest weights, reminded me of the trickery that was being used to lure people onto fishing boats. These people were expecting one kind of a job, but they got a different job. They were expecting a decent rate of pay, but they got little pay or no pay, and they were tricked into that situation. So we're not doing that. We're not personally tricking anyone, we're just paying what the supermarket charges, whereas the Israelites were personally doing this trickery. But we're benefiting from that trickery that's been used to get people onto the boats that makes our prices cheaper and so on. So I kept on thinking about that, and then my mum came to me. She'd been hearing the same stories in the media, and she's like, you care about fair trade. Do you know what we can do? And that gave me the impetus I needed to actually seeing if there was. So without very much hope at all, I emailed the two companies whose fish I bought most commonly. And I simply said to them, look, I've been hearing these stories. How do you know that your supply chain is slave-free? And I was super encouraged by the response. I contacted Brunswick Sardines and I contacted Sealord about their salmon. And both of those products turned out to have actually really good reasons for saying that right back to the boats, their supply chain was slave-free. So encouraged by that, I just started going through the supermarket, sector by sector, asking all the major brands the same question, how do you know your supply chain is slave-free? So far I've gone through tinned fish, I've done fresh salmon, pet food with fish in it, it's quite a big source of fish, and also fish oil supplements. And I've been super encouraged that in every case I've found at least one company that's auditing their whole supply chain. I've been pleasantly surprised that there actually are heaps of good options out there. So as you see, that's how I got started. I was just looking for food that I could buy that I was cool with. But as I put more work into it, I started to want to really find ways to share what I've been doing. On the one hand, the more I read, the more concerned I became about all the people who were being hurt really badly on our behalf. And I wanted people to know that was going on. On the other hand, it didn't really make sense for someone who was concerned, so shares those concerns, to start from scratch like I had, when I've already got a whole bunch of information about what's the good options to buy. So we started thinking and praying and looking and trying to find opportunities to share. And in the second half of last year, we heard that Tear Fund, the development charity, was putting on a thing called the Justice Conference. And we wondered if that might be an opportunity. We heard that they had opportunities for charities to come in and have a stand, have a table, talk about what they're doing. So we contacted them and said, we're not a charity, we're just some people. But could we have a stand? And they were really open to that. So we quickly got a name and a website, and Just Kai was born. As I said at that time, I was really ill. There was no way I was personally going to go, but my husband Martin and our friend Sarah, who are here today, and another friend Anna, agreed to man a table. However, about a month before the conference, Martin felt called to pray that I would be able to go too. And to be honest, I found that idea really threatening. I was quite big on not getting my hopes up and just living a quiet life that worked for me. But he called a few friends to pray with him about that, and we later learned that at least 2 other people independently were especially praying for my healing at that time. Also about that time, our church had a regular prayer meeting, and a group of people came from church to anoint me with oil and pray at that time as well. Nothing changed after either of those things. But during the week before the actual conference, I started to wonder if maybe I was going. Twice during that week, God spoke to me through my Bible readings with things that really leapt out at me and seemed to say, this is what I was going to be doing. I also won a ticket to the conference, which I couldn't go to it without. So on the Friday morning, the conference was Friday evening and all day Saturday, I contacted a friend and arranged for a lift to go to the conference, but very much stepping out in faith and trepidation because I was still at that point really ill. But the whole day I was just doing averagely atrociously, and there was no way I was going anywhere, and I was really devastated. I just stayed home. However, on the Saturday morning, I woke up and I just felt different. We didn't have much time to think about it. Between waking up and leaving the house was about, 15 minutes. So I just got up, walked around a little bit, thought, no, my body is working really differently. We just threw everything we could think of that would help me cope into a big bag and left. And I was at the Justice Conference from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. And it was super noisy, there was heaps of people, it was really light. I was still using the wheelchair, I still had 3 or 4 naps during the day, But as recently as the previous day, there's just no way I would have coped with that. So on the Sunday, we went off to our church and gave thanks. At that stage, we didn't know, was this a one-off? So I could go to the conference, which in itself was really encouraging. But it basically seems to be holding. I've continued to get fitter and stronger. My stamina is still very poor, but I'm doing very well on the whole. And also opportunities to share this work keep on coming my way. This seems to be my calling from God, for the moment at least, and for now at least I'm treating it as my job. So that's, I guess, background to what I've been doing, why I've been doing it. I'd like to take some minutes now to talk about what I've actually found. So when you came in this morning, there was little flyers that you could pick up in the foyer. If you haven't got one of those are now on our table. And they've got logos of brands and certifications to look for in the supermarket. If you'd like more detail, there's also our website addresses on that flyer, and that can link you to buying guides that you can download and take with you to the supermarket. And there's also a bunch of research articles on the website where I essentially justify why I've chosen those brands with a gazillion links. You'll also see we've got the table that a bunch of you have already come and had a look at, which has got examples of good products that we're confident are slave-free. And on that there's also a few hard copies of the buying guides if you don't want to download them. So as I've been saying, I've been focusing on the food that's at highest risk of slavery in its supply chain, and that's fish, cocoa and sugar. I'm going to talk about cocoa and sugar first because they're more straightforward, and then move on to fish, which is a lot harder. So in terms of cocoa, certifications are your friend. There's 3 marks up there that you can look for. Anything you find that's got one of those on is fine from a worker welfare point of view. So the first one, the Fair Trade logo, you're probably familiar with. That's used very widely. If you buy something from Trade Aid, it's got the round World Fair Trade Organisation logo on it instead. In terms of how those two organisations are run, they are very different, but in terms of the standards they look for, they are basically identical. So either of those are good. The one on the right, UTZ certified, you may well not have seen before. That's a Dutch certification that's new-ish to New Zealand, but it's very reliable. You'll see that on Kit Kats, on Milo, and also on quite a lot of the home brand products from Countdown. And if you see any of those, you know that there's been no slave labour, no child labour, but also that working conditions have been safe and people have been paid enough to live on. The other thing you can look for when it comes to cocoa is single origin Samoan cocoa. So far as I know, Samoa is unique in terms of the countries that grow cocoa, in that no one has ever, or no one has recently at least, found child or slave labour on cocoa plantations there. So anything grown in Samoa is also fine. And I have a comprehensive list on the website that you can download that's got everything I know of that's got those on. So that's cocoa. Sugar. I haven't talked about sugar so far this morning. It's something that's a bit newer to me, but forced labour is actually quite common on both the farms where sugar cane is grown and also in the mills where it's processed into actual sugar. So if you want to avoid supporting that, you can look for either of the Fair Trade logos again, and you'll see them on some brands of actual sugar and also on some sugary products like the Nice Blocks Ice Blocks, for example. But to be honest, things with Fair Trade logos on for sugar are a bit obscure, a bit hard to find. You need to go to organic shops and places like that. So the easiest option for sugar is to buy Countdown home brand sugar. That's got the latest certification, the Bon Sucro certification. Again, that's a European certification. It's mostly used to bioethanol, but then for anything to do with sugar. And it guarantees that there's been no slave labour, no child labour, and safe working conditions. So fish now is your hardest thing. As I said, it's the food at the highest risk of slavery in its supply chain, which is not that surprising. It's very hard to police what happens on a fishing boat far out to sea. And forced labour is disturbingly very common. A lot of the fish here comes from Thailand. There was a survey done a couple of years back of workers on Thai fishing boats, which found that 17% of workers on Thai fishing boats were there against their will. So a lot of forced labour. And as I said, also there's no certifications, so I've been contacting the companies directly But I have been pleasantly surprised that there are a reasonable number of companies anyway, bringing third-party auditors deep into their supply chains. In terms of what to buy, my primary answer is buy from Sealord. I've been very impressed by their deep commitment to checking working conditions right throughout their supply chain. And they're not just looking for child labour and slave labour, they seem to be really committed to providing better than average jobs right the way through. Everything from Sealord is good, and they do tinned fish and frozen fish fillets and all kinds of things. But in terms of tuna, I would also say that they are your only option. They are the only company I have found that actually literally sends auditors out to boats at sea to work out what's going on. One place you might not have thought about fish being is pet food. Fish is really common in pet food. If you look at dry cat food, almost all of it has fish in it. It might say it's beef flavoured or lamb flavoured, but if you look at the ingredients, you'll find fish oil or fish meal somewhere on the list. And it's in a lot of other pet food as well. Pet food is complicated because most of the fish that goes into pet food is scraps. It's stuff that's left over after the fish has been processed for human consumption, and those scraps get amalgamated, joined together. It can be really hard for even the companies themselves to know quite exactly what it is that they're selling. But in that context, Purina, I've been really impressed by them. I wouldn't for sure say that they are 100% slave-free, but they're doing an awful lot more than basically anyone else in that area. And if you're interested in other fish, I have guides available for fish for people, tinned fish and salmon, pet food and fish oil supplements, so you can get them from the website, or there's a few hard copies on the table there. This is very much a work in progress. The next area I'm hoping to do is crustaceans, so crayfish, prawns, that kind of thing, and also squid. And so if you're interested in following along as there's more information, on the flyer there's a link to our website, which has a blog that you can subscribe to, and all the new updates appear there, or also a Facebook page where again I'm putting all the updates. So that's what I've learned in terms of practical things. I also feel that doing this work has taught me a lot about both God and people. It's really reinforced to me how we are all made in the image of God. We all have God's goodness in us, but yet we're also all fallen and corrupted by sin. In terms of the fullness of people, I have literally been having nightmares when I've been reading the stories about things that happen on fishing boats and on cocoa plantations. People are doing terrible things to other people out there. I haven't told many of those stories today, mostly because I find them really disturbing. But I know that there's some people who relate better to things when they can read stories. And we've got a folder on the table over there with some journal articles and some material produced by various charities, which you can have a look through if you'd like to read some stories. But it's really brought home to me that there is great wickedness in people. And yet it's also shown me the goodness that's in people. We are all made in God's image. We all have God's goodness in us, whether we even know him or not. And I've been astonished at the great goodness of journalists and fisheries observers who put themselves at enormous physical risk on fishing boats so they can shine a light on what's going on there. People have died doing that work. Just yesterday I heard of another case in Ghana of a fisheries observer who's gone missing off a Chinese boat. But people keep on stepping up to do that work. I've also been amazed at the goodness of companies who are working really hard to meticulously trace long, complicated supply chains so that they can make sure that everyone working for them is treated well, even though most consumers aren't even aware of this issue, so it's not going to affect their sales whether they do it or not. I've also been amazed at God's goodness towards me. After so many years shut inside with so little contact with the outside world, it's really neat to be able to contribute to something people are valuing, and it's really neat to see God enabling it, both through my physical healing and also through the opportunities coming my way to share. And I'm particularly grateful to Jodie and all of you for the opportunity to share with you today. Thank you.